Hello, everybody. Once again, my name is Vernon Ware, and we are coming back to continue our conversation on trauma. And today, what I would like to do is talk about some of the responses that we have to trauma. And really, the first two I really want to deal with are ones that we've probably heard about for most of our lives, and that is the fight or flight response. Actually, for trauma, there actually can be up to four. So, fight, flight, freeze, or what we would even call fawn or people pleasing. But if we look at just the first two, those are the ones that we most often see persons exhibit, and those are the ones that most often we have to deal with ourselves. And I do want you to understand that all of these responses are almost instinctual. These are things that have been built into our DNA, built into who we are just as human beings. And so immediately once we see a threat, then often the fight or flight response jumps up in us. And that is actually something that is not just mental, but also it is physical as well. Certain chemicals are actually produced, and our body is actually shifts and changes itself to be able to do one of two, or as we'll talk about, three or four things. But the first two is obviously either to be able to fight, to deal with the threat, or to be able to flee, to flight, to get away from it. And I can give you a perfect example. Let's just say you're driving, on the Beltway and somebody cuts you off. In the moment that they cut you off, you sense or feel a threat. And so at that moment, you may immediately make a move to the left or the right. You may brake, whatever it is, but then you're going to have an emotion that comes behind it. Most often, if you're like me, it might be anger. And in that moment of anger, you actually can do one of two things. You actually can say, I'm going to follow that person. I'm going to get behind them. I'm going to what? Attack. And that is really on the fight side. Or you can have it where it's on the flight side. Let me get out of this lane. Let me get out of here. And that becomes really what is most important. That becomes the priority in the moment. Well, let's shift that to your being at work. And then at work, you have someone who puts you in another threat position. Maybe not physically, but what they may say to you, what they may say about you. And so therefore, your body doesn't know the difference between a physical threat and an emotional threat. And so what happens is that those same fight or flight responses jump up in you. And then those are the things that either I'm going to come back and eliminate this threat. I'm going to come back at this person with the same fire they came at me. I'm going to come at them the same way. Or let me just get up out of here. Let me be able to move myself in some way, shape, or form out of this situation. Now, even though these are natural and have been built into us for our survival, if we let them have total control, as you can think about it, they would then equal or lead to some really bad situations. Let's say it's someone that threatens you emotionally on the job, where they're talking about your work and you're taking it personally. And then at that point, that fight response jumps up in you. And then if you decide, okay, I'm going to cuss this person out, I'm going to hit this person, I'm going to come back at them just as hard as they're coming at me, then what happens is that can have negative impact over your life. But let's say it's flee. Let's say that you just go ahead and say, okay, I'm just going to not say anything. I'm going to actually just get out of this situation. That may not be the best thing for you as well. Now, when we attach these normal responses to threats to having dealt with trauma before, what happens is that these responses often are energized. So therefore, because you've had a trauma in your life, that your fight or flight response actually becomes over actualized. It actually becomes over energized. And so therefore, if it's a case where you feel, or in a lot of times you hear a person say, I feel triggered. And what is a trigger? A trigger is simply a reminder of a previous trauma. And so it's not the trauma itself, but it reminds you of a previous trauma. And once you are triggered, you are actually in your mind back in that same space where the trauma occurred. And so sometimes you'll see a lot of times in movies where there might be a veteran who hears a car backfire and it takes them back to when they might have been in the war. But even simpler things like tone of voice. If you were a person that had to deal with someone that disapproved of you all the time, spoke down to you all the time, somebody completely different may just use that same tone of voice, and that tone of voice can trigger you, can take you back. And so, therefore, it's understanding that in many cases, we cannot eliminate our triggers because they are reminders of trauma that already has happened. It's almost like if you had an accident on your bike when you were a child and you have a scar. That scar is still there because of what had happened. But what we can control is how we deal with that triggering or that trauma trigger. And that's what we'll talk about in the next section. And that's what we'll talk about when we move forward. But I want to just deal with the fact of persons being triggered. We use that word a lot, it's said a lot, but I really want to make sure that we can understand what we're saying. Once again, a trigger is a reminder of a previous trauma. Now, I may be upset about something, but that does not necessarily mean that it is a trauma trigger. But when there is a trauma trigger, it is for us to understand that there are some changes that immediately happen within us, that our body immediately thinks of the threat and actually thinks of the trauma that we already experienced, and then moves in a way to protect us from experiencing it again. And so that's where the fight response comes in. Let me deal with whatever this threat is so that I won't have the trauma again. That's where the flight response comes in. Let me make sure I get away from the trauma or get away from this threat so I won't be then traumatized again. But then also we have the freeze. The freeze is similar, and I think we've all probably seen this on not a commercial, but maybe on a comic strip or something, is when the ostrich puts his head in the sand. That's where we kind of do nothing, where we kind of try to detach ourselves. And in that moment, we hope that the threat will just pass away on its own. It's almost like you watch a horror movie and the person says, okay, I'm going to be real still and I'm not going to make any noise. And then hopefully then the danger will pass away. And then the last is really what we call fawn or people pleasing. And that's when we try to then almost just make the threat go away by being real nice to it. That's when sometimes persons will just, for lack of a better word, compliment persons that they don't really want to compliment. They'll agree overly so with something that they don't even agree with, but it's partially so that they can just get out of that situation. And as I said, all of these are instinctual, but just because they are instinctual, it doesn't mean that they have to have control over our actions or what it is that we do. And so once we go into part 2 of this, we'll talk about how to then deal with these trauma triggers. This has been our time for today. I'll see you next week.